everyone. I wanted to demonstrate the process of how I make my tiny little bud vases and show you what it looks like to go from a lump of clay on the wheel to a pretty little bud vase. I have been making bud vases all week for my cousin Aka's wedding. Here are some of them that I made earlier this week in what we call a bone dry stage. Most of the moisture has come out of them, and they're going to be ready to put in the kiln pretty soon and then glazed. Here are some at an earlier stage. These are called greenware. They're a lot wetter and more pliable, so I can put them on the wheel and trim them. They are not trimmed yet. The feet are not trimmed yet. So, the first thing I'm going to do is start with a lump of clay on the wheel, like so. And I have patted the clay into a ball and then literally threw it onto the wheel as close to the center as I could get. And I'm going to do the rest while the wheel is spinning, but I try to get it fairly centered before I even spin the wheel. Then obviously you want to have your clay lubricated or your hands are going to stick to the clay. So I drop a lot of moisture on there and start spinning the wheel. Now I'm using my elbow to brace my hand against the clay so that the clay is becoming symmetrical. And it does take a little bit of muscle, but it's also the positioning of your hand. So what I'm doing is I am shaping the clay into a cylindrical kind of cone shape, lifting it up and then pushing it back down into itself. It's sort of a way of wedging the clay to get the air bubbles out, if there are any, and to center your clay on the wheel. So now I have a lump of clay that is centered on the wheel, pretty much. Okay, so I'm going to flatten the top out so that I have enough space to bore a hole. So a little piece of clay just popped off the top and I had to reintegrate it into my lump of clay here so that it doesn't become a hazard. So I'm nice and centered. I'm going to take my thumb. I take my thumb and my pointer finger, my left thumb and my right pointer finger to start to bore a hole right down the center. And I'm going to want to go down far enough that I have plenty of clay to work with for the body of my pot, but not so far that I'm going through the bottom of the pot onto the wheel. I want these to hold water, and so they need to have a floor or a foot. As I do that, I'm going to continuously pull the water out of the floor, and that'll prevent S-cracking when you put it in the kiln. So now, I'm going to start to lift the walls up. I'm going to take I have a really nice fine sponge here that I use to help me lift the walls of the clay. And I'm going to sort of push in and up, stabilizing the clay with the inside finger and lifting the clay with the sponge on the outside of the cone that I made, or the cylinder that I made, keeping it lubricated. And you don't want to pull too fast, but if you don't pull fast or hard enough, you're not going to move the clay. So there's a fine balance in there. And this is going to be a tiny little, 2 or 3 inch, maybe 3 or 4 inch bud vase. So I'm not going to go too much taller than this. And I do want to leave some thickness at the top because I intend to give this a tall, skinny neck. So I want to make sure that I have plenty of clay to work with once I've ballooned the belly and I'm ready to make the neck. So I'm going to give it one more pull upwards to give it a little bit more height. And again, I want to leave some clay at the top for my neck. Okay, now I want to make sure to keep pulling that water outside, inside the base of the bud vase out. And I just want to keep compressing that floor of my vessel, and that will help prevent cracking in the kiln. Alright, so I'm ready to give this thing a belly. Now I accidentally widened the neck a little bit. I want this to stay sort of compact and close to the center because it's going to be a tiny little neck when I'm done with it. So I don't want the clay to get too tired and go in and out. I want it to stay fairly close to the center here. Okay, so now I'm going to lubricate the walls, and I always have to pull that water out of the floor. And I'm going to go in with I'm going to be careful at the top not to compress the lips of this pot down because I want to keep that height. So I'm really being mindful of what my hands are doing at the top here while I'm ballooning the belly from the inside. And I'm getting a little sticky in here, so I'm going to lubricate. And once again, pull that moisture out of the bottom. And I'm starting to get a nice little round shape here. And again, I'm keeping this clay at the top kind of thick so that I have room to play when I pull my neck up. And now I'm moist on the inside, so I'm going to give it one more, I'm going to give the belly one more push. I really like a nice, big, fat, round belly contrasted with a tiny little skinny neck. It just kind of gives the pot this like luscious feeling with that nice contrast. Okay, so now I'm going to shape the belly a little bit more before I work on the neck using my rib tool, which I bend so that it forms a rounded edge, and I'm going to just pull off that moisture while I'm also shaping the belly nice and round. Okay, so that's sort of the gist of the shape that I'm going for, and that'll make a really nice contrast with a nice little skinny neck here. Now what I'm going to do is start to collar the clay inward. I'm sort of using like the tip of this finger to just encourage the clay towards the center. And collaring is sort of a tricky, advanced thing to do on the wheel. But the idea is to just sort of slowly and gently encourage the clay inward without going faster than the cadence of the wheel. So it's sort of an intuitive thing that you get to know the clay and the wheel over time and how fast you can spin the wheel without losing control of the clay, and how fast your fingers are moving along the clay body, because it's pretty easy to just like rip a neck like this off if you go too fast. So now you can see that the lip is becoming a little bit asymmetrical. That happens, not every time, but it happens often. And I sometimes like to go with that and leave the neck a little bit irregular at the top. It's just kind of interesting. So I'm just rounding out that belly and leaving the neck kind of raw because I'm still going to work with the neck here. And I want to just get this sort of belly shape the way I want it. And that's a nice rounded belly. So I'm going to come in and color this a little bit more. I'm encouraging the clay in and up because I'm looking to get a little bit of height with this neck. Now, my neck is a little bit thick on the inside, so I'm going to take my pin tool and just pull out some of that excess clay to thin out the neck a little bit. I want to make sure that I can actually put a flower in this later, so I don't want the walls to actually touch or come all the way together. I want there to be an actual hole in there. You can close a piece entirely, and those are pretty cool too, but these I'm leaving open so that you can put a flower in it. Now, you can see that the lip is, I'm going to get my towel, a little bit lopsided. So what I'm going to do is take my chamois, literally a car chamois, here, dip it in the water, make it nice and soft, and use it to finish off this lip. Pulling off some of the excess clay, and kind of alternatively pulling the excess clay off the inside and then the outside. The inside I take it off with my pin tool, and the outside I take it off with this chamois or my finger. Oops. When I accidentally closed it, but that's alright. I'm going to cut the tippy top off. And actually that kind of helped with pulling off some of the excess clay. And just ever so gently encouraging this neck up and in, but not too far in. Alright, so now I'm going to go back in again and finish the lip. If I can find my chamois, here it is. And literally, sometimes what I do is I just drop a wet chamois into the opening and let it rest on the edge here. It's pretty delicate at this point, so just running the chamois along the top of the wet clay is going to shape quite a bit. And add a little bit of pressure to round off the lip. Would like a little bit more height on this neck. Very careful not to completely close the neck here. And I'm going to I pulled the lip out at the top just a touch to give it a little bit of flair. And again, I think I need to go out a little bit more even so I can get a grip on that lip. Lip is becoming a little bit more refined, and one thing you want to be careful of is not just pulling your hands off the clay or the pot that you're making so fast. you want to kind of leave the clay gently so you don't throw the pot off. Alright, now I've got this refuse to kind of clean up. I actually kind of like the way it looks, and I may play with that intentionally at some point, but for today I'm going to clean it up. And what I like to do is add to that contrast, that's nice fat belly and tiny little neck, with a little bit of surface variation as well. So I like to have the clay body, the body of the pot, very smooth and round, and the neck I'll leave a little bit of texture from my fingerprint or a sponge, just to kind of like frame it and give it a little contrast. So I'm using the sponge to add some little tiny lines and texture. This neck got a little funky. I'm just going to make sure that it's streamlined. And finish it off with the rib. See how my shape is looking. Not bad. This is a cute one. They're all just a little bit different, which is why they're fun. And that just about does it. Now I'm going to cut it off the wheel. I'm going to just finish off this texture here with my sponge. It just adds like a very delicate ribbed kind of texture, or like little tiny lines that contrast nicely with the body. And now I have a piece of my hair stuck in it, so I have to very carefully snatch it with my pin tool. There we go. Alright. Now, we have almost just about a finished piece. Well, it's actually far from finished. It needs to be bisque fired and glazed and glaze fired again. But as far as the throwing part goes, this is done. Now I'm going to take my wooden trimming tool and go in at the foot and try to follow the line of the curve so that there's continuity in that curve. I'm going to pull off the excess clay. And we have a finished pot that's about to come off the wheel. It will need to be trimmed, bisque fired, glazed, and then glaze fired before it's an actual finished bud base. But that's how you get, oops, that happens. That's how you get from a lump of clay to a functional vessel. I actually stabbed it pretty good. So I think what I'll do is add a little bit of clay to the hole that I made with my rib tool and smooth it out and go back over it with the rib. So the clay is still malleable, it's still wet, I can still mess with it to some degree. I want to use the curved edge to follow the curve of the pot. Great. So there you have it. A tiny little bud vase. I'm going to pull it off the wheel with my wire tool and set it to dry, and then my next step will be to trim it, and then fire it, and glaze it, and fire it again. Okay, thanks for watching. Have a great day.